This is Father Gregory Pine.
And this is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
And welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. For this episode of Guestsplaining, we're delighted to be joined by Father Tad Pacholczyk. So thanks so much for joining us on Godsplaining.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It is certainly our joy, and I had the pleasure of hearing you speak once. I think it was 15, 16 years ago when I was a student at Franciscan University of Steubenville. You spoke about embryonic stem cell research. In the conversation before pushing record, we discussed how that particular conversation has, it just hasn't had as much sustained interest because the money is already there, and so people tend not to care about whether it's ethical. But there have been obviously a variety of bioethical conversations in the meantime that have sustained interest, upon which you have spoken and published in a variety of different media. And so people obviously people will know your work from the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and from various other things. But for those who don't know you, or just as a way to orient us, would you just say a word about who you are and what you do and the work that you're presently engaged in?
Yeah, sure. I do work for the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I joined them back in 2003, so it's been a good 20 years now. And I serve as the Director of Education. So this means that, as you pointed out, I do travel around and speak on different topics. Embryonic stem cell research used to be really the issue of the day, and I was speaking all over the country and overseas about it as well. Now, a little more focus on things like transgender issues, and always an interest in talks on end-of-life decision-making. So I do a fair amount of that. Our center also works closely with the bishops, so every 2 years we put on a kind of a mega conference in Dallas for the U.S. bishops and for bishops that we invite from Canada, Central America, and sometimes the Philippines. And we do this together with the Knights of Columbus. And we typically get, 100 plus bishops who attend. We give them a couple of days of updating on the latest issues in bioethics. So that's another aspect of our outreach. And we also publish in the area of bioethics, and we also help bishops and dioceses and Catholic hospitals when there are kind of complex questions around cooperation and evil. So maybe you've got a Catholic hospital and they're saying to themselves, there's another secular hospital down the road, and they do abortions there, and we would like to share a surgical center with them, or maybe just share a parking lot with them. How do you figure out what's allowable, what's not allowable? And those can be quite complicated types of questions, which require that we actually look over collaborative arrangement, documentation, that kind of thing. So, we do a lot of work in that area as well.
Okay, so many of those things, folks, if you're interested, you can follow up at ncbcenter.org, just to hear in general about the work of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. And then Father Tad's talks and publications and other things besides can be found at his website, which is fathertad.com. So FATHERTAD.com. So we thought that a way to approach this particular episode was from the kind of Catholic who wants the perspective of a Catholic who wants to, be as innocent as a dove, but perhaps as crafty as a serpent, which is to say, doesn't want to incur the guilt, which could be incurred if you dabble with things like, if it comes to maybe vaccines, or if it comes to particular research, or if it comes to a line of, like the way that you describe parking lots, brings that to our attention. And we thought one good way to approach this particular question was with respect to these, HEC293 cells. So it became a big topic when many of the COVID vaccines were made available, but it's been a topic insofar as they have been at least part of the kind of testing or development or even present in vaccines for some time now. So could you just orient us to the HEC293 discussion for those who aren't up to date, so as to kind of set the stage?
Yeah, the HEC293 cell line is HEK stands for human embryonic kidney. And it's a cell line that was developed in the 70s, and it has become very, very widely disseminated among researchers. So scientists who are developing new chemical reagents or doing gene work, human gene work, they often rely on HEC-293 cell lines. They've just been distributed everywhere. And so you mentioned vaccines as one area where the development of certain vaccines will rely on either testing or the actual development process on these cell lines or on other ones that may also have problematic origins in the sense that they may have also come from an abortion. So the way these were procured originally, there was an abortion that happened. A researcher showed up afterwards and at the clinic and basically said, do you have any fetal cadavers that I can take cells out of and use for my research purposes? And they were able to obtain cell lines that way. And so some of those have become almost in a way that's impossible to dislodge. They've become incorporated into the general flow of scientific research throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Father Ted, that gives a nice specific case of how we're entangled in cooperation with evil in a sense. And someone might think, oh, well then if that's evil, therefore we shouldn't participate in it at all in any sort of way. But the Catholic Church has moral reflections, principled reflections that aren't just compromises. I mean, people might think Catholics are trying to be moral, but then they're also willing to compromise. Maybe walk us through, you mentioned a little bit, how a Catholic thinks about the issues of participating in these evils, as distant as you say they are, and why that's not just compromising, but actually a principled reflection on what it means to engage in the world morally, especially the modern world.
Yeah, I would say that the categories of cooperation in evil have been very carefully thought through by the Church and really provide very helpful kinds of touchstones, guideposts, points of reference for us. In the sense that, if you look at it in the very broad sense, the question becomes basically, am I making too strong a causal contribution to the evil that somebody else is doing? And if you're making a weak causal contribution, so something you're doing is not essential, it's, very removed from the action of the principal agent who's doing the evil, it's likely that in the face of a proportionately serious reason, you will be able to cooperate. But there will be certain types of cooperation that you will be causally simply way too close to the evil that's happening. So simple example, you have a clinician at an abortion clinic who's carrying out an abortion, and you're a nurse there, and you're actually handing the suction device to the physician, or maybe flipping it on as he does the abortion. Clearly, your causal contribution is very, very significant. It's very close. It's what we would term immediate cooperation in evil. And that's a type of cooperation that even if, you're in a situation where you're saying, I have to support my family and this is the only kind of employment I can, etc., you have to still step away from it because you're causally too close. But on the other hand, if you're, let's say, the groundskeeper at the abortion clinic and you're just trimming bushes outside, the causal contribution that you're making to the commission of the evil, it's clearly many levels removed from what the principal agent is doing. And there may be, in that case, a proportionately serious reason that you could say, at least on a temporary basis, I may be able to trim the bushes outside the abortion clinic. But you do have to be also very attentive not only to the categories of cooperation and evil, but there's a second set of categories which we call theological scandal, which one wants to be careful to avoid entanglement in as well. And that might be the sort of thing that, if you're the groundskeeper and you're at St. Philomena's parish, and somebody at the parish finds out, oh, you've been trimming the bushes over at the abortion clinic, and they say to you, well, gee, so do you really think abortion is sometimes okay? And then you're sort of caught in a quandary. You'd have to really make sure that you took care of that potential for theological scandal, because it might even be the sort of thing that they would say, well, Bob, who's trimming those bushes, he seems not to be opposed to abortion, and my daughter just got unexpectedly pregnant, and therefore I'm going to more seriously consider taking her to an abortion clinic, so that our actions can be misread. He may in fact be on the pro-life committee at St. Philomena's, but he would need to, take steps there to limit that potential for scandal. But, circling back to cooperation in evil, there will be very helpful analyses that we can do that will allow us to discern whether or not it is appropriate for us to make that particular causal contribution to the evil action of a principal agent.
Okay, so I want to follow up on the description that you gave of limiting or distancing ourselves from, and then you described in this example how on a temporary basis one might be able to justify or rationalize such employ. So I think perhaps one of the notions that we maybe falsely introduce into the conversation is this idea that our moral life is taken in snapshots, and we begin to think of our whole moral lives just in terms of either permissibility or non-permissibility, and then we're evaluating how does one describe that? You're evaluating different moral moments as if they were unconnected based on whether they're permissible or not. Whereas what you describe has more of a kind of dynamism to it. It's like we're limiting, we're kind of exercising an active agency, or we're distancing ourselves. So there's a temporality to it, but it wouldn't be something that you would want to find yourself in for a long time. So I think that provides us a good transition point. So Catholics are going to kind of touch upon these questions from a variety of different vantages. You might have somebody who wants to get into gene therapy and vaccines, like microbiology program, or you might have a mother who's making a decision for her, child whether or not to vaccinate, or you might have people who are just thinking in terms of their careers. They're working in a lab at present. They're introducing this cell line. Is it perhaps time for me to found my own Catholic, genetics or bioethics? I don't understand the thing well enough to describe it in a way that's accurate, but you see where I'm going. Maybe could you offer some principles for kind of Catholics on the way? Not in the sense like, yeah, you might be sinning now, but hopefully we won't sin later. But in the sense of like, how do we progress through these steps so as to make better decisions and so as to distance ourselves, but ultimately so as to draw near to the Lord?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's an element here of actively choosing what you are going to be doing in terms of your actions. And of course, our actions contribute to our own formation. It's a kind of, that's what growth in virtue involves, that, we're transformed in either a positive direction, virtue, or in a not positive direction as we move towards vice. So these choices matter. It's not just the snapshot kind of, once off or once in the moment kind of discernment that we get drawn into. So I think for a student, for example, who maybe is approaching graduate school and they're interested in doing some gene cloning or some other vaccine development work maybe, and they're checking out different labs at a particular school in a particular department, whether it's molecular biology or neuroscience or cell bio or whatever. And they do need to do their best to upfront understand that there is a concern around the use of cell lines that are derived from abortions. And it's better for them if they have this kind of degree of freedom of movement, as you often do when you're starting early in your studies and you're choosing a lab intentionally, that you try to avoid labs that are using some of these established cell lines like HEC293, and choose other labs that would use maybe non-human cell lines or human cell lines that were not derived from abortions. But, maybe, for example, there's some cell lines that are derived from cancer tumors that, have been turned into useful tools for researchers. So doing that up front, I think, is important. Now, does this mean that you have to absolutely scrupulously avoid every single lab everywhere that has any problematic cell line? Well, the answer, I think, would be no. It's not going to extend that broadly. And if you have some particular angle of research that, you're going to be going into a lab and you're, as far as you can tell, not going to be involved with problematic cell lines, even though other people, maybe just on the next lab bench over, they are going to be using the problematic cell lines, then there may be reasons to do that, and you might even think of it as there will be some opportunities for discussions where I'll be able to influence lab mates around the question of the origins of some of these cells, and maybe even the PI, the principal investigator, to be able to sort of heighten awareness of some of the ethical issues. Because sometimes scientists haven't even begun to process that. They're not even aware of the origins, really. They just know this is a workhorse cell line, everybody uses it, and they don't know about the problematic origins in any kind of detail. So, there are going to be many variables here that will affect decisions like that. And so just to give you another example, I've had students who have moved into a lab, started a research project, a graduate project. They're more than halfway through to getting their PhD, getting their doctorate. And all of a sudden they realize, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that this HEC293, where it came from, and I've been working with it, for 2 years. Do I have to throw all my research data into the trash and start over? And they come to us and we'll say, well, no, you don't have to throw it all into the trash. You can continue to work here, but this is something that you should be, if there is an alternative moving forward that will work for you and not compromise all the data that you've accumulated up to now, then you should look at that. If it won't, delay you by 5 more years of work kind of thing, then you should look at that. So, it becomes an active discussion, and it'll depend sort of how closely also they're working with these cells. Sometimes they're working with them themselves. Sometimes they're doing a project where they hand off what they're doing to somebody else who will then use the HEC293 for testing, that kind of thing. That's going to be different. So the devil is in the details sometimes, and it's important to be very, very specific. When we have people come to us for consultations of this type, we have usually a fairly extended conversation. What exactly are you doing in the lab? What is your association with these cell lines? How far along are you? Many other questions that will be relevant to assessing whether they are in a position that they can either give witness or step away from the project, or choose a path that doesn't involve any connection to the abortion-derived cell lines.
Yeah, and I want to follow up, Father Tad, on the devil's in the detail business, especially with modern medical sciences, you could say. The beauty of it's the chiaroscuro, flip side of the coin of the ability to have all these great medical gifts. What someone might have died from even 30 years ago now is standard procedure. We have great blessings in our medical sciences and improvements in this way. Yet it also means we live in, you could say, fraught with some dangers and some potential pitfalls to avoid. That gets very complicated with these things, especially morally considered, especially because I think in modernity we silo off like the technical skill of just doing something, and then moral. We treat morality as it's this other thing, totally separate. And this happens in medical schools, I'm sure, and it happens in other schools, engineering, business, and all of this. We get these kind of things. So, Mike, I guess what I'm aiming at is thinking about the fact that so much of our sin, at least in the modern world, is oftentimes started by ignorance and getting involved in something, as you mentioned, like a project you didn't even know about, and now you have to do something about it, puts you in this. And so much, I think, in our life of sin, starts in these situations. But to help us think through, for someone thinking about entering nursing field or the medical field, what are some of the things you see today that you can say ahead of time? Now, this is something you should be aware of because your medical school or your hospital might not raise these questions or think about these end of life issues, this kind of thing. What should a medical professional be thinking about as a Catholic that they might inadvertently get involved with because no one was telling them? What are some of the pitfalls and the dangers here?
Well, I would say it's going to depend on the specialty to a high degree. So, for example, people who might be moving into OBGYN, obstetrics and gynecology, there's a whole raft of moral concerns and, flashpoint issues ranging from abortion to direct sterilization, tying of tubes, how do you handle ectopic pregnancies, how do you handle some of the complex pregnancies where there's maternal fetal conflicts that arise. Those areas are very complex, and there is a lot of pressure, I would say, professionally today to kind of conform. And by that I mean sometimes quickly to, for example, prescribe contraception, quickly to urge abortion as a solution, etc. So that would be, OBGYN areas. I mean, you mentioned end-of-life areas. I think if you're moving in that direction, the question of really understanding and appreciating hospice and palliative care and how these areas are so practical and important, and how they also serve as an important potential deflection point for the rising tide of expanding physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, that we need to have, people who are well trained in these areas of pain management, for example, to sort of be able to tamp down the growing pressure to make physician-assisted suicide universally available. Other areas, I think, the transgender area, we see a lot of growing pressure there among surgeons, for example, to get involved, or endocrinologists to become those who prescribe hormones that will facilitate this transitioning of an individual from male to female or vice versa. And very, very significant ethical concerns around all of those approaches. And I think a lot of professional pressure being levied, being applied to, even at the medical student level. So sometimes medical students are going to have to, understand that at least in the interests of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, that they are going to need to specifically request to be exempted from certain types of participation, like participation in an abortion. They'll have to say to their mentors, to their superiors, that they can't participate in that, even though they'll say, well, it's just typically part of the training. I have to say, I understand that, and I'll, be glad to look at a textbook that describes certain things, but I'm not willing to scrub in, on this one.
So I think, sometimes when we, have these conversations and we recognize the degree to which we are compassed about by those who would have us do things which would lead to our moral destruction, to the destruction of those with whom we live, it can be overwhelming. It can be saddening. And certainly the world, the flesh and the devil, I mean, our fight is not with flesh and blood, it's with powers and principalities. And they want us overwhelmed. They want us saddened. They want us anxious. And I think that I'm thinking of the story of the life of St. Thomas Aquinas, where he had resolved to become a Dominican. His family wasn't for it. They imprisoned him in their family castle. I mean, a light imprisonment, but imprisonment nonetheless. And his brothers had the insight that if we can get him to fall, into vice, into sin, then he'll get off his high horse, and then he'll just be about the serious business which we have envisioned for him. And so they introduced a prostitute into his room. St. Thomas very serenely conducted that prostitute to the exit with a firebrand, and then burned a cross on his door, and then was girt about with a kind of angelic chastity. So I think that the world of flesh and the devil, they know what they're doing when they try to implicate us, or when they try to compromise us, as it were. And for us, again, it can be overwhelming. So maybe as a kind of like final word or a final thought, what are things to have before our minds, or virtues that we're seeking to cultivate in our hearts, so that we are, less overwhelmed, perhaps less sad, and less anxious by, the enemies which are ranged about?
Yeah, well, I think, in that sense, just taking the time as Catholics to form ourselves, to, go to talks around these issues, maybe do a little reading, do some, there are plenty of good resources on the internet, including, our website, which you mentioned earlier, the ncbcenter.org. And I think when you do that and you sort of get a better sense of the parameters of, what's allowable, what's not allowable. I also run a certification program, and we graduate about 100 students a year from that. Many of them doctors, nurses, priests, others. And, it's just an opportunity to sort of really understand where are the lines of God's will. And if I live in that and make it an intentional choice, I am opening up a path towards beatitude, a path towards blessedness. And living really an integral life in this way is a path of fulfillment. And on the other hand, if I don't do that, I'm going to become, for example, a physician who's, compromising on the right, compromising on the left. And I think I have to do it. But at the end of the day, you're going to be miserable as you pull against the fabric of your own conscience. So it really is the Lord offers us a higher path, and it is higher, and it is definitely more beautiful, and it is humanly and divinely so fulfilling when we have that determination to pursue and remain on that kind of a path.
I'm Father Ted. I just want to encourage people to go to your website and to learn these things, because they also can see some interviews and some debates with you and some and others. And your calm demeanor, I think, is a beautiful witness to the fact that there's no need to get upset or over, emotional about these things, because they're true and they're good and they're beautiful. And you can feel confident in proclaiming Catholic truth in these such situations. And your website has many, so fathertad.com, I think it is, has many resources there and links to other places that if you're in the medical field and you're thinking about today, or just if you're just a human in America today, you're going to have conversations on transgender and these sort of things for our listeners to go to these sites. And also the final point on that is, it's a beautiful fusion of ever ancient, ever new, because the images in the top of the website are these delightful black and white, kind of look like they're from, I don't know, the Little Women book or something, like an old-fashioned books. And yet here we're talking, this is a man who is Yale trained in neuroscience and using fantastic words that I have no idea what any of this stuff is about. So it's that there is this continuity of both the beauty of the human civilization and yet, acronyms and all sorts of numbers that are involved here. So but your demeanor is delightful, and the confidence in the truth is something that I think we can also imitate in approaching these issues and letting people know that you can calmly proclaim the truth, because it is something that they ultimately all desire.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate the work of the Dominicans in trying to support that kind of balanced approach. I think it's humanly very wholesome, and I think the more we can do of this together, kind of arms locked together, we build up the church and we strengthen one another.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate that the end of the episode would be like a kind of panegyric or a commendation of your excellence, but I find myself tending in a similar direction. And I was thinking about this recently because you treat a lot of issues which people feel very strongly about and which people argue about very vehemently and vociferously, but you're able to do so in a way that's very serene. And it's not patronizing or condescending, which is where people who try to be calm generally tend, which is more frustrating than just being angry, because it's like, at least I know you're honest. But when okay. But I think that something that we've kind of become accustomed to is making an industry of outrage. So like, people over here are saying this, but then my people are saying that's crazy. But there's no positive project, right? There's no real effort at education, right, or at formation. But the fact that, boots on the ground, you're doing things for education and for formation and providing people with the resources, which is to say like the principles and the arguments and, the different things which give them access to the truth. That's awesome. So awesome is probably not the most inspired word with which to end said panegyric, but again, thanks.
Well, thank you both very much. Really great to have the chance to parse a few of these issues, and maybe we'll have another opportunity another time.
Oh, I hope so.
That'd be excellent. All right, so we'll turn now to the listener and say thanks as always for listening to Godsplaining. We heard both of those websites at the outset, but ncbcenter.org and then fathertad spelled out.com, where you can find all of those resources and begin your own kind of independent formation on these issues, so as to be better equipped, so as to be more, as it were, rooted and grounded in the love which the church brings to bear in our lives. So please do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And then if you would, like and subscribe and whatever the other thing is that we typically encourage. Oh yeah, leave a 5-star review. Cheers. And if you'd like to donate to the podcast through Patreon, please follow the link in the description or in the show notes. There, you will also find links for 1 merchandise and for 2 events, which is to say retreats, our first of which is in June. Applications for that are open. So we'd love to see you there at the Malvern Retreat House in Malvern, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And you'll also find information for the 2 retreats, which are to follow in August and in November, respectively. So, know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Godsplaining.